All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hassan, and I, along with my colleagues, are delighted to welcome you to this month's Community Talk series hosted by Our Future is Science. So this series is a part of the Mentorship and Scholars programs of Our Future is Science. We are happy to welcome to the public as Zoom allows us to democratize these programs. OFIS is an initiative of Aspen Institute's Science and Society program. As an organization, we are committed to sparking curiosity, passion, and confidence about STEAM in young people to push science forward in the 21st century and solve society's most pressing issues. We are generously supported by the Amgen Foundation, the Samueli Foundation, Burroughs Wellcome Fund, 3M, Carson Family Charitable Trust. Without these funders, none of this would be possible. The Community Talk series is a platform to expose individuals to diverse careers, as well as information, insights, and perspectives on the intersections of STEAM disciplines and social justice issues. And tonight we will focus on how STEAM and social justice connections can influence urban agriculture and the implications for climate resiliency. From addressing climate change to increasing access to healthy food, creating initiatives to support community gardeners, to innovations in composting. There's so much to dive into tonight. We have some phenomenal policymakers, community leaders, and advocates who are working to create healthier, more sustainable communities in New York City. Tonight, we will hear how New York City is leading the way in sustainability and urban agriculture. I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Ebony, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, John. Good evening. I extend a warm welcome as well, and I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's first speaker, Qiana Mickie, who is New York City's inaugural Executive Director of the Office of Urban Agriculture. Under Ms. Mickie's leadership, the office aims to advance urban agriculture and equity to actively address climate, health, and food disparities in the city's natural and built environment. By collaborating with interagency leaders, as well as a breadth of urban agriculture stakeholders, Ms. Mickie has developed innovative initiatives to foster healthy, culturally relevant food production, educational trainings, and economic development opportunities for farmers and producers in New York City. In the first year of her tenure, Ms. Mickie has developed initiatives such as re-imaging farm to school in New York City, building the MWBE pipeline for small and socially disadvantaged businesses, and bolstering land security of community gardeners. She recently released New York City's first urban agriculture report and action plan. Ms. Mickie is also the founding principal of QAM Multiprize and former executive director of Just Food. For over 12 years, Ms. Mickie also worked on local, state, federal, and international policy on issues such as food sovereignty, land stewardship, and health. Ms. Qiana Mickie has a BS in marketing from Hampton University and received her Food Hub Management certification from the University of Vermont. She serves on the USDA Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production Federal Advisory Committee, International Council of Urgency, and the Coordination Committee of Civil Society Mechanisms for the United Nations. I now turn the floor over to Ms. Qiana Mickie. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ebony. My bio is so long, so thank you for reading it. And I think this will be a good jumping point to jump into the deck, and I'll share a little bit more about the office and what maybe some of that work means. Thank you. And I'm sorry if my voice is a little off. I had a few earlier panel sessions this morning, so I've been talking, but is everybody able to hear me okay? Oh, fantastic. Great. Well, I'm really excited to be here. It's always great to talk to students, but I was particularly excited when the team reached out to talk about the intersection between science and social justice. Oftentimes, those two aren't always in the conversation, so it's really great to see young leaders wanting to do that work, and happy to kind of share a little bit more about how I've been doing it and what I hope is a pathway for others to come. Next slide. Thanks, Hassan. So you heard my bio, but the little things that I did want to share is I was technically born in Richmond, but I grew up in the Bronx. But that background gives me the opportunity, I think, to I had the chance to learn and have this like countryside and element from my family and my dad's side, and really kind of get connected to the earth and growing. Some of my earliest memories of growing tomatoes and cooking with my great grandmother, but also growing up in the Bronx, really having this connection to the city landscape and getting a chance to see how the city has changed over the last couple of years. And so for me, I think it really kind of gave me a chance to really see what agriculture can be as a whole, but what is the potential and what we can do here in the city. So now I, get to see other folks grow those same kind of tomatoes, as well as like other culturally relevant foods. One fun fact about me is that I am proud to be a fourth generation HBCU college grad student. So that means my great grandmother, my grandparents on my mom's side, as well as my mom, went to Benedict College. I ended up going to Hampton and had a BS in marketing. They had a background in science as well as education. So I think that has also kind of helped inform how I've gotten to become into this work. So in the beginning, I've done different things in terms of nonprofit work, in terms of wanting to work in entertainment. But what I realized ultimately was my goal was to really connect folks to quality goods and services, in particular communities that weren't getting them. And that kind of led me into volunteerism around food justice and becoming a community advocate that worked on food justice and policy. First, initially in New York City, and then considering how to expand that into federal policy, like the Farm Bill. And what that gave me the chance to do over the course of a couple of years is it opened the door for me to see like what I can do as an individual, but how I can engage and learn with and build collective powers within my community and build community, and also how we together can change and inform and build and create change structurally, because you really can't do it by yourself. And with that, learning how to work with farmers, small scale farmers, learning exactly like what are the bounty and the opportunity is here that we have to grow, the opportunity to train community leaders so we could start community driven models that brought healthy fresh food in the community, whether it was grown here or grown in our state or in our region. And then also how we can create market opportunities like community run farmers markets or CSAs so folks could have that food. And of course, another element of that work had been community chefs. So training folks to learn, no matter what their aspect was and their passion was in the work of food justice, and trying to find a way to really support the right to grow and sell food. How are these different avenues and careers that we can connect to our passions? For me, it really wasn't about growing, but I really saw the importance of that connective tissue work, the importance of policy and people being aware of how it impacts our life, especially food and farm policy, but also feeling like there's a voice that they have and that they should have this information, and there should be more transparency so we can again connect to that power and make the changes that we can and should see. And for me, in addition to doing policy and wanting to continue to see how I could build impact, it really kind of also led to wanting to build new models, business models, community-driven models. It also helped me, inspire me to take the role of being an executive director of a nonprofit to see how I could genuinely operationalize that work and how to operationalize equity. So it was not just a vision or a statement, but actually how to bring that to life into work. In between, after that, I started a consultancy, as Ebony mentioned, and then this unique opportunity in 2022 came about when the city had, for years, there were advocates talking about the need to have an office that really focused on urban agriculture, not just the policy around food, but the actual support of work and innovation in agriculture and needing an office. And I remember being an advocate and kind of going and submitting public testimony around what the office can and should be. Never did I think that one day, the office would be established, and two, that I would be its first executive director. But it's given me the opportunity to establish this office from scratch or from the ground up, to really not just connect to what I have like grown to know in the last 12 years around urban ag, but really take a step back and think about how at a city level we can and should be planning and building to support the breadth of urban agriculture models, the regenerative practices, and the people, because there's folks that are doing it in so many different ways, whether on their windowsills at home, to community gardens, through sweat equity, all the way up to businesses and even scaled businesses. So here is like the mission of the office. When kind of reflecting and thinking on that, what really came to be was we needed the office to define how the city can increase the access to and the production of locally grown food. You know, to me, agriculture is a critical component of climate justice. So we needed to also incorporate that so we can really acknowledge that the city has contributions to climate crisis, but how we're able to reduce that or at least mitigate and spur economic activity through agriculture. And that's a diverse economic activity. One, because I think it's important that folks feel like there is opportunity for livelihood in the spectrum of agriculture and science and food work and research, but also sometimes we create or we generate in urban agriculture a product or an activity that we don't always get a chance to monetize. And I don't want it, so I wanted folks to feel like through agriculture, we can create paid opportunities where you wanted to start a business and feel like that was an entry point for a lot of folks, in particular folks of color and folks from mixed income backgrounds. But also, even if you were doing work like climate resiliency, growing food, and donating that food to your community, if you were, growing and building compost, that there still was a value to that, and that there was a way that we can continue to help inform the city on how to support those efforts and work. So here's just a little overview of in the first year, some of the things that we also heard from stakeholders on what our office needed to do. So you see things that have the intersection around economic factors, the social implications, as well as like policy considerations. So from land tenure to land security, which can look very different for a lot of folks in urban agriculture in New York City. Many folks are not going to be able to afford land in New York City, but it doesn't mean that they can't be climate stewards in that work. So are we creating opportunities where folks are able to go into gardens and put in that volunteer work to create spaces for growing, spaces for respite, spaces to learn? But are we also identifying other land, underutilized land, maybe even buildings that could be retrofitted that could be used in this urban ag work? Could this be spaces for indoor growing, like controlled environment, like hydroponics, where you may not be using soil, but you're using other mediums to grow food? Are we also doing, creating efforts around stormwater mitigation? I think we all kind of got through last night's rain. And as you can see, that climate crisis and these kind of inputs are really kind of impacting our neighborhoods. So are we also considering how urban agriculture can use, whether it's stormwater mitigation and doing green roofs on the top of roofs, or really supporting multiple green spaces in our city to absorb that water? Are we creating those opportunities there? And also, are folks, in particular folks of color, folks that are living in these communities, have the opportunity to do this work, whether through volunteerism or can see this as a career in that projection? And then lastly, I wanted to mention too, just supporting innovative farming practices, because we have so many folks from school gardens to community gardens on on city land like NYCHA, and you're going to hear from the folks from Green City Forest and Domingo and Tonya, but also folks that might have different access to land like rooftops or private development. How are we supporting these different practices? And then here is a little bit about the plan. So over the year, I was able to try to think through the breadth of this work that is already happening in the city, but also thinking how to leverage city assets like space, like license agreements, like land use agreements to kind of help. So here are some of the top ones. One is farm to school. This creates this opportunity to support ag education for public school students while they get hands-on experience with growing in the classroom as well as urban gardens and working and learning from farmers of color that are representative of those communities, oftentimes probably grew up in those communities. And so there's a connection between food, there's a connection between purchasing for the city to get that food into schools, but also that these students are able to learn now and able to see that these can be potential careers in the different aspects of farming that it can take. The other piece around innovative land use, and again, this opportunity that we have to connect to science, research, innovation, advocacy, these are so aligned with the office principles and also the work that we need to see in the city. So how can we really explore land use and create more opportunities in our city that creates a chance to build resilient models, food production, scale food production? How do we truly find places to be eco centers to grow food that we need for our community and beyond? And then supporting urban agriculture and growers. There's a lot of great history here in the city. There's a lot of great partners and work doing this work already. It's really also for the city to figure out how can we support our partners in the work that they're doing, and again, best leverage city assets like capital, buildings, land, resources and opportunities, equipment, but also are there ways that we can explore how to support funding to those folks so they can have permanence to their work. Next slide. And one of the things that I thought would be really good to hear and kind of connect the dots to the other panelists is connecting community to urban agriculture. Oftentimes people feel like they don't have a connection to urban agriculture, but in fact, we all grow food and we all walk in our neighborhoods and we all live in the city, whether your city is New York City or whether you live in another one. So actually, urban agriculture is oftentimes our most direct connection to our food and to our potential to enact power. So through urban agriculture, what we've been trying to do with this office is find ways that we can continue to build trust, gather more comprehensive urban ag data, can you support new metrics, especially around climate resiliency? Again, ways to kind of talk about innovation in not just food production, but what are the great and multiple diverse ways and approaches and practices that are happening, whether indoors or outdoors, soil or soil-based work, to really kind of talk, to get that information so it can really tell the story of the city. What needs to be supported, what is the potential, and where maybe assets should be moved forward. Also collaborating with researchers of color. There's a lot that is that I, as an office, maybe can and shouldn't do, but there are ways that I can amplify additional research. I think there's a lot of opportunities in urban agriculture to expand on research and have folks be the drivers of what we're building out and learning from. It doesn't always have to come from an academic lens. I think there's ways for community to be seen as researchers as well or be a part of that. But when we do work with academic partners, something that I've identified is in particular working with ag scientists, soil scientists, folks of color, that is their field in terms of science, but also with the lens of urban agriculture. How do we identify things such as rock dust trials to see if we can increase the nutrient density in food grown in urban centers? How do we actually quantify and demonstrate the power of carbon sequestration? So the sinking of carbon that is, you yes, the sinking of carbon that's kind of in the air and actually using it to either to grow the food that we want. And also soil being this really powerful tool to also be a place for remediation, for healing. Oftentimes people think about food, but there's also other things that come. Compost, from organic compost, of course, but also things like hemp. Hemp is something that could potentially be grown. And I know we oftentimes people think about hemp as consumption. I'm also really curious about hemp as a product, as the commodity. Can it be used to be a product to build concrete and fabrics and textiles? Is this something that we can and should do? I've heard, and I've been doing a little bit more research with other folks to find the potential of what policy can be here in the city around that, but also the remediation opportunities that come from it, and how often can that soil be used to, hemp can be used to remediate soil, but then also be used for that products as well. And in order to engage average folks and increase awareness so folks all feel like they have a part in creating this urban ag landscape, been putting out listening sessions where I actually am hearing from folks, as well as trainings like a farmer producer training for farmers of color to connect. So always trying to find a way to be reciprocal with the information that we're gaining, so we know what we could do at the city, but also knowing what's happening on the ground. And then in the last few minutes that I have, I, wanted to also mention, one of the things that I learned with the trajectory of my career is it's not often a linear path when we do our work. Fields emerge and they also collapse. But I think with urban agriculture, it's one of these fields that continue to keep it growing and evolving and expanding in terms of opportunities, not just to do this work through passion, but to potentially find a longer career and livelihood. And I think people, if you're willing, if youth in particular are willing to explore and expand their skills, these are just some of the few kind of areas that come up often in terms of agriculture and career opportunities in education and agriculture. Continuing to build climate smart policy, science-driven data and research, collection, evaluation, building biodiversity in multiple mediums, like growing food, indoor and outdoor even, agri-voltaics, connecting and co-locating solar and bringing that energy in, as well as vegetation and growing. Renewable energy is continued to be a topic that kind of comes in. Again, not just from a climate justice perspective, but also urban agriculture. Are we able to use, the different forms of energy through urban agriculture? And of course, what people mostly kind of are familiar with, cultural relevancy and building food production and connecting that to biodiversity. These are just some of the examples that people are starting to get jobs and continue to expand and explore. My call to action would be, I know the mentees are going to do a project. I would say if these topics continue to be interest, if there's things that maybe stretch yourself to think about a field or an area within urban agriculture potentially that maybe would be a stretch of learning for you. Think about the impact that you might be able to build and have, and the skills that you already have, and how can you bring that to a new topic that maybe is not familiar in this coming year. So what you're learning, you're able to share and provide, or share with other folks what you're learning, how to generate impact on the individual level, but also is there potential community or collective power opportunities to build together? Like, what is the impact that you would like to have and see? How can this work that you're doing, say if you're interested in hydroponics, if that's something that you want to do as an individual, growing mushrooms indoors, things like that, or different mediums, is that something that can have an impact in a community? If so, how? Is that, food opportunity? Is that, creation? Does it, bring in other chances to kind of share that learning with folks? How do you connect with folks that maybe don't feel like urban agriculture is something that's really connected to them? And then lastly, when you're considering your projects, not just thinking about the practical logistics and, and building your timelines and stuff, think about the joy. One thing that in the midst of crisis, I think sometimes it's so easy to forget, but what really sustains us throughout these hard times is joy. How do we build joy? How do we find joy, reconnect to our passion, find new ones? Sometimes when you're building out your career or you're expanding, you realize your interest changes or wanes, but it doesn't mean that you can't pick it up again in some other avenue. So in terms of thinking about your project, something that I would encourage you to do as well is not just think about how you're building nature-based solutions and how you're able to address the issues and disparities that we have in social justice and what science can do to bring solutions, but are you also incorporating joy into your work? And if so, how? And then I might need a reminder, one for a time check, but also are we doing questions based on each panelist or at the end?
We're doing it at the end, and we're perfect on time.
Oh, so excited for that. Well, thank you. I know I ran through a lot of things. I did share, I'm sharing this deck. I wanted to also share my contact info. I will also share some other links if folks are interested in learning about some of the other work that we've been doing in depth, like urban ag policy, as well as the urban ag report.
Thank you so much, Qiana. That was amazing just to hear, what leadership New York City is taking in the area of urban agriculture, and your tips for the students as they're just beginning to think about their capstone projects is really invaluable. And I imagine so many students are interested in pursuing projects based on urban agriculture now. So thank you. And I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Tonya Gale. Tonya Gale is the Executive Director of Green City Force, which is an amazing organization in New York City, which I know all of our speakers know well. Green City Force trains young people from low-income housing communities for careers to create sustainable and resilient cities. Tonya also previously served as the lead of Green City Force's development team. And she has spent most of her career in nonprofit organizations focused on economic justice for young people of color. And prior to joining Green City Force, she served in public-private partnerships at New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, and the Sponsors for Educational Opportunity Career Program. Tonya is also a board member of the CORE Network, which is focused on national service, and Environmental Advocates of New York, focused on environmental justice. And if that's not enough, she's also a member of the New York Women's Foundation Circle of Sisters for Social Change. Tonya is a native Brooklynite and a graduate of Wesleyan University, and also worked as an associate producer on a documentary, the 2006 film, The Perfect Life, featuring young adults from Harlem. And as you will hear from her tonight, she's passionate about providing young people with viable paths to create and lead a just and equitable world. And you'll hear more from her now. Tonya.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's really exciting to be here. It's always fun to have these kinds of conversations with new friends and old friends. Qiana is an amazing champion across the city of the work we're doing. We've been very thankful to have her leading this work across New York City. So I want to go through my slides fairly quickly. We can go on to the next slide because I want you to be able to hear from our wonderful graduate, Domingo. We can go on to the next slide. So Green City Force, GCF, as we call it, is a nonprofit organization. We train young leaders, young adults, to power a green and inclusive economy through service. And our focus is really a holistic model that is committed to social justice, economic justice, and environmental justice. So that all that we do has that underlying theme of what we've been trying to focus on in our mission. We are a nonprofit, but we believe our work is a mission. Next slide, please. We have been around since 2009, and we focus most of our work in the 5 boroughs of New York. And for those of you that don't know, the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, which is the acronym, is about 500,000 people in New York who represent about 1 in 15 New Yorkers. They're low and middle income people. And at the time of pre-pandemic, about 72% of the roughly 50,000 young adults who live in that community had high rates of unemployment. That was before COVID. And so in addition to being a workforce program, we're also very focused on climate justice and environmental solutions driven by the people who come from the communities hardest hit by these issues. Next slide, please. So again, these are some picture of some of the buildings across New York City that are NYCHA developments. They're concentrated, dense housing communities, about 2,600 buildings, something like 174,000 apartments. So very significant amount of people who are living in dense areas that are subject to all kinds of environmental challenges due to various changes in investment or lack of investment across the years. Next slide, please. And so what we do is we recruit young people, 18 to 24-year-olds. We're in an AmeriCorps model, which means we use service as a way to learn about environmental issues, to train young people who come from affordable or low-income housing, who have a high school degree or credential. And we train them in 6 to 10-month full-time service. And we help them to build skills while they are driving change in the communities that they come from. They are Service Corps members. And our end goal is for these folks to be successful by building their own personal workforce skills while they're transforming their communities, and then to move on into alumnihood, where we're focused on preparing them to be competitive for jobs in the green economy. And we build that up through coaching, support, staff, and a community that's about lifting up, all that are part of our program. Next slide, please. So they start by coming into us full-time as Service Corps members. We work to position folks to be competitive for jobs in the green economy, and we support them through some of our hiring back, which you'll hear a little bit from Domingo about. And then we're really about trying to lead folks towards a path that can give them careers and thriving livelihoods beyond their young adulthood. Next slide, please. Over the course of our time, we have placed graduates in all different areas tied to sustainability and environmental solutions. You can see a lot of our folks historically have worked in jobs related to energy and buildings. We have folks getting jobs in horticulture, nutrition, and food, of course, through the urban agriculture work that we do. Zero waste, you'll hear a lot about through Domingo and other areas. And so our whole mission is, how do we take all of these holistic pieces together that are all related to environmental solutions and climate solutions, and train BIPOC young folks to be the drivers of the change we want to see in the communities that they come from. Next slide, please. And so practically what that means is that across the buildings and towers of the 5 boroughs of New York City, we have built and managed currently 6 large-scale urban farms. We call them eco-hubs because they are food producing spaces, outdoor spaces that are community informed. We work with the young people and the fellow residents in the community to design workforce training opportunities, to get community connection, to provide food, and to do transformation of the land that may have been previously used for negative or non-environmentally positive projects or priorities. And we're building a whole ecosystem that's really designed to be a model for what can happen in cities across the world, really, driven by communities who are hardest hit, as I said, by environmental challenges. Next slide, please. So over the course of our time, we have grown and distributed over 150,000 pounds of free, fresh produce to the communities of public housing residents. We distributed in weekly farm stands and nutrition, education, and food production. And we asked residents, instead of money, to exchange the food delivery for either food scraps. Again, you'll hear from Domingo about that, or volunteer time. You can see some of the outcomes over the time we've been in programs. And in terms of the assessments and analysis, we spent about 3 years around 2019 working with the CUNY food policy folks to train our young people to do analysis about the outcomes tied to the work we're doing. We also do farm-based learning, where we bring younger elementary school students into our spaces and help them understand, as an urban young person, that tomatoes don't grow in supermarkets, but actually grow like literally in their backyards. And so it's a really inspiring and positive way to transform the way young people and others think about what the power can be in the communities they come from, which they might not have naturally thought was an option. We are flipping the narrative about what happens in low-income communities and training the people who come from those communities to be those drivers of the change we want to see. Next slide, please. And so to that point, we have a philosophy at Green City Forest that if you can see it, you can be it. So if you have a chance to meet somebody like Qiana and you never thought that you would want a career in urban agriculture, you have a role model to understand what that can look like. Domingo is another example of someone who you'll hear from who didn't originally think he probably was going to end up in the work that he's doing today, but through role models and examples and showing folks what's possible, we've been able to have amazing folks go through our program like Domingo. I'm going to let him introduce himself in a minute, but you know, he's phenomenal and is a combination of a workforce trainer partner, a thought partner, a social entrepreneur, a scientist, and an employer. And he was able to win in 2020 one of the first ever hundreds of $1,000 prize award in New York City, one of 5 people across all of New York City to win this award for him to be able to launch his new initiative, which you'll hear about. So there's a very short video we're going to show you that's about a minute long, and then I'm going to pass it on to Domingo and let him share his story with you all. We can play that.
I was born and raised in New York City, lived in every borough. I was in my mother's building in New York City Housing Authority, and I saw a flyer for Green City Forest. Green City Forest was, you know, an AmeriCorps program that reaches out to youth who actually live in New York City Housing Authority, and they invest in us and they give us transferable skills. Those first 7 months that I was in Green City Forest, I went to a compost site. In the past, composting has been really centralized. There's a few community composting sites, but most of the composting that was happening was funded by the city, funded by the Department of Sanitation. And as soon as they lost funding, the compost sites just stopped. So I plan to actually build grassroots composting sites, grassroots educational spaces that can continue to thrive even when we are faced with a pandemic or a recession, because it's community driven. I want to show people that composting can be a beautiful thing.
Thank you, Tonya, for the wonderful presentation. Before Domingo speaks, I'll give a quick introduction. Our next speaker is Domingo Morales. He's a Green City Force alumnus, the founder of Compost Power, and a compost consultant. His leadership and passion for a healthier and more environmentally just city were born from his lived experiences. As a former public housing resident, he saw firsthand how residents of underserved neighborhoods and public housing suffered from poor access to healthy food and the lack of sustainable infrastructure. After serving with Green City Force in 2015, his life trajectory changed. Today, Domingo supports Green City Force and New York City's Housing Authority as an expert on composting and waste diversion programs, and coaches others to implement best practices across the city. Domingo is laser focused on making composting cool and accessible for everyone, and he is fascinated by the science of composting, which you'll also hear a little bit about. So welcome, Domingo.
Awesome, thank you, and thank you for welcoming me to your group. Tonya, thank you for teeing me up. You do a very good job of talking about my work better than I can. But I just wanted to start by saying, just to give everyone in the call some background, I was not into farming. So for those of you that are like thinking about farming, you're like, I don't know about that. I was a germaphobe, afraid of germs. I didn't want to be on a farm. And Green City Forest forced me. They dragged me onto the field and they're like, you're going to learn how to do this stuff. And I wanted to do solar energy work. So I had to farming had to grow on me. So I just wanted to give that background. And when I joined Green City Forest and I actually graduated 7 months later, I was really interested in composting instead of farming. I kind of catered to systems and what happens behind the curtains. And I kind of made sense of how we're growing food, we're planting seeds, we're watering, we're fertilizing, photosynthesis happens, we get food. But what really struck me was the science that was happening underneath the soil, and the microbes, the cation exchange capacity, the bacteria communicating with fungus, and mycelial networks under the soil that connect everything is really what brought me. It kind of attracted me because I've always been a person who gets really bored when I learn something and there's nothing else to learn in that craft or that trade. So I have a lot of electrical experience, plumbing experience, doing roofing, carpentry. And I would always get bored with these random things that I did before Green City Forest. But when I found Green City Forest, I found my match. I met my match. Urban agriculture, community composting. You never get bored with this stuff because there's always something to learn. And every time I think I know it all, I'll speak to someone who's 80 years old who teaches me something that I didn't even think of. So that's why composting was it for me. And I kind of started working for the Brooklyn Botanic Garden right out of graduation with Green City Forest. And when I started working with the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, I was managing the largest compost site in the United States that didn't use fossil fuels. So that meant 2,000 plus volunteers throughout the year that were actually coming to help us do that work. And a large number of volunteers were coming from Green City Forest. So I was able to use that site to train the young adults that came behind me on the site that I learned at. And I was able to continue that closed loop circle of I learned, I mastered the craft. Now I need to teach it to the next gen, and they can take it back to public housing and they can build these solutions. But one problem I always had was my site was at Red Hook. And if anyone on this call knows New York City, Red Hook is kind of like New Jersey. It's not really New York City. It's cut off by a large highway, the BQE, and then it's also cut off by the water on the other side. And it takes about 2 hours to get to Red Hook if you live anywhere else in the city that isn't Carroll Gardens or anywhere close by. It takes 2 hours. So I would have to commute 2 hours from East Harlem to get to work at Red Hook. And the young adults that were serving in Green City Forest had to make that same commute just to get to where I was to learn these skills that I learned. So I always wanted to build compost sites in public housing, but my job with the Brooklyn Botanic Garden had me so tunnel vision, day to day, have to manage volunteers. We have to turn these compost mounds. And I just didn't have the time. And then COVID happened and the city shut down all of its composting initiatives. And I took it, hit me really hard. I was laid off, but on top of that, composting was my life. This is what I did. This is what I spent 5 years doing before COVID happened. And instead of just giving up, starting a new career, I decided to kind of take it back home and bring it back to my roots. And I went back, I spoke to Green City Forest, I called them and I said, hey, you guys are amazing at farming. You taught me what I know, but I've been mastering compost for the last 5 years. And I actually want to bring those skills back to the public housing community because there aren't many composting programs or composting experts in the public housing community meeting these young adults where they are. So that's how Compost Power was born. In 2020, the city defunded their composting operations, and I would not let NYCHA go down. So I'm like, we're going to build a new program. I'm going to partner up with Green City Forest, bring it back to my roots. And when I applied for the David Prize and won in 2020, that was just a start to something amazing. Compost Power's mission is to build out sustainable compost sites across New York City with an emphasis on public housing and marginalized communities, providing all residents with access to waste equity, sustainable education, job training, and we're laser focused on making compost cool. And when I say making compost cool, what I mean is when most of the people I talk to who've never been to my compost site talk about composting, they think of landfills, they think of heavy odors, they think of rats running over people's feet. And our composting sites are not like that because we want people to come into our site and feel invited and feel welcome and safe in our space. So Compost Power is showing people that you can compost even in a dense area like a public housing community that is surrounded by buildings without bringing rats into the community. You actually do the opposite. You're reducing the rodent population by removing food from the source, removing food from the trash so rats have nothing to eat. And then on top of that, we don't have any odors because the science at our site is down to the T. We use enough carbon, we have enough oxygen, and our microbes stay nice and aerobic so they don't smell. So that's the background of Compost Power. That's our mission. Next slide. Yeah, so in New York City, 30% of our waste is compostable. So all of the food that we buy, all of the food that we grow out of state in Mexico and California and all these other countries that come to New York City, 30% of those resources are actually being thrown in, well, 40% of the food is being trashed, but 30% of our trash are those resources that are being trucked far and wide and being sent to landfill. So for me, that number is huge. And if we can eliminate that 30% of organic waste from our trash, we can slow down climate change by 30%. And this is assuming every country, every city gets behind that. If everyone in the world started composting, we could slow down global warming by 30% because we'd be reducing the methane that's produced from these food scraps that are sent to landfills in large plastic bags. Next slide. So 40% of all food. So the food we grow, the food in supermarkets, if you think of food, 40% of it in the United States go uneaten. And that is a pretty big number. If you think about it, 63 million tons of food is trashed annually. And that's a lot. 1/6 of the methane being produced on landfills is coming from our food waste. So we could reduce the methane being produced on landfills by 1/6 if we just stop sending organic waste to landfills. And if you wanted to put that in monetary value, that's about $200 billion that we're losing in the United States every year to this wasted stream of food going to landfill, food not being eaten, food being thrown in the subways, and rats taking them to their own little caves somewhere underground. And I think that that's a form of food injustice, which is why I think so tied to farming, gardening, and sustainability is food injustice isn't only certain food, good food being in certain areas or certain people living in food deserts. It's also like, what are we doing with the wasted food? And if we're just throwing it away and getting rid of those millions of dollars, billions of dollars that we're pouring into this food production, then we're kind of doing an injustice to our people, but also an injustice to food overall. Next slide. Yeah, so I've been talking a little bit about like why compost, but I put this slide here just to show you what a aerial shot of one of Green City Force's eco hubs looks like. And if you're looking at this and you're wondering, is this actually in New York City? It is. And notoriously, we have concrete jungles in New York City where we don't have any soil. We don't have any native soil. And if we do have soil, some of it is contaminated with lead, arsenic, other heavy metals, dogs poop and pee all in our soil all year round. So our soil is a little too contaminated to grow out of. And most places like Green City Forest Farms, we build wooden boxes, raised beds where we have to import some soil, as well as some organic matter, and actually manufacture the soil that we're going to be using to grow food. And if you think about that system, and if you know a lot about the science and what's happening, microorganisms like to work with fungus and roots to actually mine the earth for the nutrients that we need. So potassium, magnesium, calcium, vitamin C, A, B, these are all vitamins that we get from food and the sun, but for the most part, we get our vitamins from the sun, and from the food, and those vitamins come from the earth. They come from naturally formed soil where microorganisms are able to kind of cycle nutrients and bring nutrients up so farmers can continuously grow from them. But if you're growing in a raised bed where the bottom of that bed is cut off and there's concrete underneath, then after you use those nutrients in the first 2 seasons, where are the nutrients coming from? Compost. That's like the easiest way. In the past, what we've done is we've used chemical fertilizers, we've used nitrate, we've used phosphorus to, rock dust to put on the beds to get those nutrients. But what we found is chemical fertilizers leach away every time it rains. And if your nutrients are leaching away every time it rains, then you have to continuously add fertilizer. And when that fertilizer does end up where it ends up, which is probably in a water system or the river or the ocean, that excess nitrogen is being absorbed or eaten up by bacteria. And the bacteria, by consuming that organic waste that you're putting in the system, they run out of oxygen. We create dead zones in the ocean. So that contributes to water pollution, right? So what we want to do, what Compost Power does, is we're trying to close the loop in the community. And Green City Force sort of started this with the eco hubs. Back when I was a farmer, it was just called a farm, and they've graduated to eco hubs where we do a lot of different sustainability programs. But what I figured is the best way for us to rebuild our soil is to create a closed loop system. And what that looks like is we're getting food scraps, right? We're a superfood country in New York City. I have residents from all over that are getting different kinds of food. Some people like mango, some people going for pineapples. Some people are like lemonade and limeade addicted. They just love lemon. So we have food from all over the place, which means we have an abundance of nutrients in our apartments, in our homes. So if we're not able to mine natural earth to get those nutrients, then we have to mine our apartments. We have to mine our trash bins, mine our black bags. And if we can take food scraps from residents, food scraps from local businesses, wood chips from cemeteries when they cut trees down, or the local trees in the community, wood shavings from wood shops, because that's our carbon rich material that we need. We can take all of that and take it to a local site like Compost Power, a composting site, or a Green City Force Eco Hub. Then we can put that into a composting system and actually start to break down those nutrients and reverse engineer what happens when we eat. When we eat, we take those nutrients and we store them in our body. They give us what we need to thrive. But then when we throw it out, what we need to do is take those food scraps and turn them back into soil so that we can put that soil back into the farm beds and the garden beds and grow more food with it. And that's what the closed loop of community composting basically is. It's just restoring that system that we have forgotten about somehow in modern America. So on our sites, we use 2 different kinds of composting. We use 3-bin systems and we use windrows. 3-bin systems and windrows are both forms of thermophilic composting. For those nerds out there, thermophilic composting is a way to compost where you're generating enough heat, and the microorganisms actually create this heat naturally. The idea is that we take all of the food waste, which is nitrogen rich, coffee, green waste from the farm, that's all nitrogen rich material. And then we take carbon rich material like those wood chips, wood shavings, leaves, which fall from the trees all year round. And we mix all of that material up after chopping it and reducing surface area. And when we leave that in a pile, what happens is the microorganisms start to decompose the organic matter on a molecular level. And they start to rip apart the cells of the organic matter. And a byproduct of that is a release of the stored energy. So all of the energy that went into growing that food, the microbes, the FBI, fungus, bacteria, insects that worked really hard to grow that food, they actually use the same amount of energy and they do the same amount of work to break that food down. So when we put these piles in our bin system or into a windrow, these mounds get really, really, really hot. The goal is 62.778 degrees Celsius. If you speak Celsius, if you speak Fahrenheit, it's 145 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, we found that you can kill most invasive weed seeds. So if you're trying to compost Japanese knotweed, mugwort, these really like mint, really, really hard crops to get rid of when they're on a farm. If we can get these mounds to that heat, we can kill those weeds. And we know that the finished product that we give to farmers isn't going to give them a random crop, because anything that the farmers don't intentionally plant, even if it's a tomato, a pepper, or something we like to eat, in that farmer's mind, it's a weed. It doesn't belong here because I didn't plant it. So with the composting, the thermophilic systems that we use, we can actually start to break down those seeds that we really don't like that linger. Could you switch to the next slide, please? So if you look at this, the 3-bin system is on your left, the windrow's on your right. And the windrow on your right isn't a complete build. It's just to show you what's inside of those mounds. When we're done, that mound really is covered up with the more mature material. But with these systems that we have here in the bin system, bin 1 is mesophilic. That would be your first stage of composting. You're probably not going to see much heat. But when you get to bin 2, as we rotate everything over, we move it over when the bin fills up, bin 2 is going to be thermophilic. That's going to be stage 2. You're going to see those temperatures that you really like. And then bin 3 is going to be your maturation phase. You'll start to see the heat die down. It will go back into its mesophilic stage, and then it will end in its maturation phase. And that means the decomposers, those microorganisms that are breaking down the food, they start to go to sleep. And who wakes up in that process are the producers. So the producers who are actually going to make sure the plants are getting nutrients, those are the guys that wake up in the maturation phase. So we have 2 different armies that work for us: the decomposition, the decomposers, the earthworms, the thermophilic bacteria. They'll really start to break stuff down. But those thermophilic organisms are going to start to kind of simmer down close to the end of the process. And when we're done with that material, we're actually able to use the compost to grow more food, grow more plants, and rebuild our soil. That being said, our impact so far, we've diverted about 417 tons of organic waste. We've given out about 141 tons of compost mostly to the Green City Forest Farms, but also residents who live in New York City who give us their scraps. If they need compost, we give it to them free of charge. Take this, you helped make this. You gave us scraps all year long. We've interacted with about 25,000 residents. And when I say interacted, that's broad. We've engaged, taught them how to separate their waste. Those are workshops that we're giving to the PAL, the Boys and Girls Clubs throughout New York City. And then we've hired about 27 GCF grads that came from Green City Forest and started on the social enterprise with Compost Power. And they've actually helped us manage our sites and also use that opportunity to learn about other things like carpentry. We have to build these systems somehow, landscape design. Where does the water go? So whenever I'm building a site, I kind of stand in the site and I watch where the rain goes just to see where the water goes. We also do we have to worry a little bit about plumbing, a little bit about electrical. So I'm able to allow the people who work with me to kind of explore composting in a different lens where they can go into different fields, and their composting knowledge is just going to be what grounded them and brought them into a new training and a new career. But yeah, that's Compost Power, reducing waste, trying to create a resource, and trying to feed New Yorkers who live in food deserts.
Thank you so much, Domingo. Let me double check my echo. Great. So yeah, that was a really wonderful talk and I enjoyed how much you were able to bring life into the work that you do in composting. My father's been composting his whole life, so I'm sure there's a lot of stuff I can share with him after this. So we understand we're close on time, so we have time for 2 questions. We will go to the chat and just get to the first 2 that were there. Setnea, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So my question was, how would we get our message across to youth or even our peers about the importance of creating these sustainable sources of nutritious food, like urban agriculture and composting, like you all mentioned? Because me, I'm like really convinced. Like I liked your presentations, like, and I took a lot from it. But what about those who might be opposed to implementing those kinds of changes into their communities, because some people just aren't really, they don't like change, and I like one opposition that I can imagine somebody might have would be like it taking a while to integrate that thing into their daily lives. So how would we go about that?
Is that for me? Qiana, Tonya, y'all want to answer that, or you want me to?
Oh, I was wondering, I think it's posed to all of us, but I mean, I'm happy to start if that's helpful. Sorry, something in the background. Yes. I think when it comes to sharing the message and getting folks that aren't as connected, especially like younger folks, I think it depends. I think there's always a lot of content, but I think people tend to listen to the people they trust and know first. And so whether that's the peer-to-peer or social media or putting it in content or right, in an outlet that people tend to use or it feels more accessible, there's always like that kind of conversation around how to like share it. But I think it ultimately goes down to who do people oftentimes trust, who do they respect, and how are they hearing it from that person in terms of what part connects. Because oftentimes what gets somebody excited and passionate in urban agriculture work may not necessarily be the same thing that like connects for other folks. Like for me, it was like policy. For Domingo, it was like compost. For Tonya, it's been like different things connecting to youth, connecting to justice, wanting to see that change. So, I would say one, think about how do you understand it? How has it changed you? How does it resonate for you? The audience that you want to share it with, what are you trying to do to bring them in? Is it something that you want them to see to change as their individual selves? Is it something you want them to just be aware of? How would you want them to engage? But I think also it's like what resonates. Sometimes it's starting where it feels like it for you, but also just might be sharing different points of it to see where it lands for them.
Yeah, I would agree. And just briefly, I would say, think about the idea of control and empowerment and somebody like a Ron Finley, the gangster farmer, right? Who basically became a farmer, an urban farmer, because he wanted to have control over the food access and the health and nutrition for his own life and his community. And so, the framing of the values tied, like Qiana said, so like what resonates with people. But from a justice perspective, knowledge and ability to control things like literally your nutrition and your access to things that are overpriced and bad for you is real. So that would be my offering.
Passion breeds passion. So when they see how passionate you are, you're going to make them as passionate as you are.
Lovely. I think for the last question we'll do, Domingo will be available for the ambassador meeting tomorrow. So Dorianis will jump over your question over to Cassandra. So if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, I think that's a good way for us to wrap things up.
All right, thank you so much for your presentations. So I'm renting in New York City, and I was wondering if there was any limitation on the use of space, like on rooftops, or if there is anything that you've seen commonly in terms of landlords not wanting to use their space for that, or why there is so much, I guess, unused space that people aren't working on. I mean, I imagine that there is some element that is the effort that goes into it, but I also wonder if like convincing people is part of it as well.
I feel like I'm always convincing people. I think part of my work is half of the people I like interact with are just too consumed with the day-to-day life. So I just focus on giving them my talking points, but also I think about things how other people might be thinking about them. So I try to change arguments like a lawyer, depending on which room I'm in, and that's sort of how I've done it. But also I think whenever you're trying to convince someone to care about something you care about or something that's important, it's important for me to learn what's important to them first, and what do they care about. And if you go in with that thought in mind, then you're already one head a step of the game, because they know that you actually care about them as a human first, and then you care about your personal belief and everything afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Agreed.
Great. So on that note, I think I'll pass it off to Ebony for our closing.
So this has been an incredibly important talk, and we are grateful to our three speakers, Qiana Mickie, Tonya Gale, and Domingo Morales, for spending this evening with us tonight. To our audience, you can extend your appreciation to our speakers in the chat, and thank you to all for attending this community talk. Please visit our website, ourfutureisscience.org, and follow us on social media to learn more about our initiative, future events, and our educational campaigns. Mentees and mentors, don't log off yet. We have a few minutes for you if you have any questions to ask us about the program. And please don't forget to complete the attendance form in the chat.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.